All right, so for this tub surround, I have selected PRISM as my grout for grouting the entire shower. And the reason I go with a product like this is, number one, it's pretty affordable. You can get this in most locations. But secondly, it's stain resistant and it never needs sealed. So once you install this, you're done. And the real great benefit is that you can really move on with your project with this. It only takes about 20 minutes to set up, and then you can wipe it off and be ready to move on with the rest of your project. So I highly recommend high performance grouts like this. There are other manufacturers like Mapei and Laticrete that make similar products. But being high performance, not having to seal it, not having to wait 2 hours to be able to remove the grout really makes a difference and allows you to move on with your project. So first thing is you definitely have to get all of the thin set and anything off of your tile prior to getting started. And you really want it to be dry. You don't want water running out of your joints in any way. This type of grout is very sensitive to water. So if you have water in your joints, it's going to wash out the joint and it's not going to basically form a good joint. I would recommend having some microfiber cloths on hand. This is for the cleanup later on, but it's a good idea to have some kind of dry cloth that you can remove the haze. Using a good grout float really makes a difference. This is made by Trox. This is a kind of like a urethane grout float. It's very kind of rigid, but also very flexible at the same time. Once you use one of these, you really kind of won't go back. So I use this basically for all of my grouting, whether it's epoxy, sanded, or high performance grouts like this, or other pre-mixes. It's kind of fits all of those patterns. So the first thing you want to do is obviously just mix your grout. Now this is going to take a little bit of time because you need to mix it for 5 minutes. Or mix it for a couple minutes and let it sit for 5 minutes and then remix it to get it to the right consistency. But this box actually has 2 pounds and they each have them in separate bags. So it's kind of nice that you can mix half a bag and know exactly what you're getting rather than trying to evaluate what a half a bag is. Really, this is probably going to definitely do this entire tub surround, just 1 pound of this. So I'm just going to mix one. You always want to measure your water. It's 1 quart per bag. And that's the other thing I was going to say. You should have a good sponge. These are probably one of the best sponges out there. I use on all my projects, the Ardex sponges. Square edges, really tools the joints nice. And highly recommend a good sponge to be able to get that removing of the grout off of the surface. So let's go ahead and mix this.
So very quickly, later on in the video, I'm going to discuss more about mixing, but unless you can work really fast, I'd recommend not using a drill to mix this particular grout. This is definitely different than a lot of the other high-performance grouts that I've used, where this stuff really sets up pretty fast when you mix it like that. So, we'll get further into the video on this, but if you mix it by hand, you're going to get a better mixture.
Okay, so first step, just take your damp sponge, just a little bit of water on it, wipe it down. The area that you're going to start with. This will help glide the grout over the tile. And then just work your way into the joints. At this point, this is just a matter of pay attention to filling the joints and not so concerned about the grout that's on the actual tile.
It's like a different tile.
Yeah, I can tell this is grittier than the Mapei.
Does that make it harder?
It does a little bit.
You look like you're using more force than usual.
Yeah, this is kind of feels more like epoxy with the thickness of it. So really the purpose, or what you're really aiming for here, is just making sure that those joints are filled. I'm not overly concerned about the excess because that'll easily come off. But if you don't fill the joints completely, then you have nothing to really tool. I might stand corrected, I don't like custom. Huh.
What day is it, honey?
September 30th,
No, I mean, what day is it?
Friday.
There you
I work every weekend. That really does make a difference.
go. Yeah, every work we've done in the past, you always work every weekend.
I know.
Just lay around and watch you all day.
All right, so that's definitely been 20 minutes on the back wall here. So really, best way to test this is just to touch it, make sure you can mold it. And if you can mold it without pulling a whole bunch off your finger, then you're good to go. And you can just test the spot by doing some circular motions on it. And if you're pulling too much grout out, then you have to wait. But I've been definitely more than 20 minutes there. So you just want to do circular motions, trying to be delicate with the joint. Have a damp sponge, make sure you wring it out, and then just hold the joint with the sponge. Paying attention to the joints, making sure they're even with the tile. That's really about all there is to it. Don't worry about any haze. We'll be able to remove that later on here. Okay, so pay attention to those joints. And what I like to do is just take a microfiber cloth and just lightly go over this just to wipe off that residue. That'll kind of help keep some of that haze. I'm only doing this very lightly. I don't want to be pulling anything out of the joints. Most of these grouts these days really don't like water. That's one nice thing about regular epoxy though, is that you can have as much water as you want and it's not gonna make a difference. So I am a big fan of epoxy. Just sometimes it's just not affordable for what you're doing. Mainly because, you know, it's about $120 a pack for it. But if you know, epoxy is no doubt the longest lasting grout out there. I highly recommend it for like walk-in showers. For tub surrounds, I mean, this is gonna stay looking great for a really, really long time. But showers with the shower floors and stuff takes a little bit more abuse. Microfiber cloth, a new one. You're gonna need several of these because you don't want it to be wet. You don't want to be smearing it because it's not gonna help out the purpose of this. So if it's dry, you can at least get some of this off of here so it doesn't haze so much. So really it's just 1 quart of water per bag. And then when you spin it with a mixer, I definitely found out it dries much quicker. So I'm just gonna use a my grout margin trowel and just basically mix this by hand. Take about 5 minutes to do. Mixing it by hand definitely makes a nicer mixture. It's not as stiff as what the drill did. I think the drill just brings too much air into the mixture. So definitely a good idea just to hand mix this stuff. But I want to give you a couple tips on grouting. This is kind of like the finished end product, and you can definitely screw up your finished look by grouting. So don't think that your precision and your really attention to detail is over at this point. This is still really important area to make sure that you fill these grout joints nicely so that everything looks good with the tile job. I hear a lot of contractors or a lot of people, they just give it to their laborer to do the grouting, and they can certainly screw it up. I'm not saying that laborers can't do this stuff. I'm just saying that you have to take as much care with grouting as you do actually setting the tile, because it's a really important part of the process, and it's really what gives a really nice look as well. And then you just go ahead and fill these joints. So really, it's the most important part of this step is not making sure that your tile is clean, but making sure that your joints are filled. It's really tough to go back later on to fill anything that you missed. So I would not be overly concerned if you have a rough tile, to not focus so much on getting the grout off of the joints or off of the tile, but rather making sure that the grout joints are completely filled, because this stuff is going to be really easy to remove. So it's not a really difficult grout to remove, but if you don't have your joints filled, there's really not much you can do, other than try to fill it in while you're doing the cleanup. Now this stuff in most high performance grouts are going to set up in about 20 minutes. So you have about 20 minutes of work time, give or take, depends on your humidity. If you have a high humidity like we are, which it's always humid here in Pittsburgh, you're going to have a bit more time. But if you're in a dry area, you have sunlight coming into your bathroom, it's not going to take long. So don't take a phone call while you're doing this. You want to make sure that you get this stuff off after about 20 minutes. And I'll show you after we get this all grouted what it should feel like and what it should look like before you remove it. So just fill all these joints, be as good as you can to remove the excess. It doesn't have to be perfect, because like I said, it's going to be able to remove very easily, but you can't really fill the joints easily later on. Keep your grout free of the corners, because that's technically a movement joint, and that's where you're going to be basically caulking that joint. So try to keep it out of the corners. And then when you go move on to the next section, just wipe down your surface. Now, you can see that I have my floor completely covered here. And the main reason I did that was because I wanted to grout everything on the walls first, do the cleanup on the walls, and then do the floor before I leave for the day. If you put too much water, like when you're wiping this off, most likely you're going to get slopping on the floor. And you don't want to be continuously cleaning up all of that in the floor and then try to do the floor at the same time. If you have any water in your joints, it's going to end up, creating a failure with that grout. So I think it's best to do all the walls first, let it set up, clean everything up, and then do the floor. And if you have any water in your joints on your floor, you're going to want to make sure it completely dries before you go and start grouting it. So walls first, floors last. And it really makes sense to do floors last, because then, at the end of the day, it has plenty of time to set up and you're not working over top of it and getting anything into those joints. But yeah, mixing that by hand, I was definitely struggling on that tub surround the other day. And, sometimes once I I should have probably just mixed a whole new bucket and started over, but I can be pretty stubborn sometimes, and and I just don't want to waste any material. So I went with it, but it was definitely a workout when it's too stiff, and doing that mixing with the drill, I think had a big factor with it. When it's too thick, it can be really painful to fill these all in, and I definitely paid for it the other day. So, and again, I mean, most of these other grouts, you're able to mix with the drill and have no problem. And I just, negated that part of this PRISM process. So this is definitely a lot easier than the mixture I was dealing with the other day. And go at a 45, try to get most of this off. But again, just paying attention to those joints, making sure that they're completely filled is the main goal of this process. Go ahead and fill them in. Good grout float really does make a big difference. If you ever got one of those cheap ones from the home stores, they definitely don't have the ability to pack it as well. A little bit more, the handle's usually not comfortable. I mean, this will definitely probably give you carpal tunnel over time. Okay, just scour over this, make sure that all of those joints are filled. And then we're gonna test the other side, see where we're at with the time frame here. Okay, so then the top here, you can either caulk it or grout it. I'm actually just gonna grout it. If it's really I have a little bit of a gap here just because of the unevenness of my wall here a little bit. So grouting, it's going to probably be the best bet. If it's really nice and tight to the wall, you can just caulk it with your painter's caulk, and that would work well as good too. Now I usually do have the walls painted before I get to this point, but I haven't had the time in this particular project, so we're just going to have to cut it in when we do the wall paint. So just know that, cutting in and painting on a grout joint can be troublesome, or a little bit more difficult than, because it really, if I had this wall painted, I could have just cleaned the grout off of it and be good to go. But sometimes the time frame doesn't work out that way. So as far as establishing when to remove this stuff, it should look a little bit dry, and you should be able to take a finger and mold it without pulling any grout off. So I'm still pulling quite a bit of grout off my finger. So I'm gonna wait another 5 minutes and then test the spot. So you wanna just test the spot, but you wanna be able to mold it with your sponge, and tool it, I should say, so that you're not pulling any of the grout out of the joints. So you have to wait until you basically can touch it, mold it, and not pull all that grout off of your finger. So we're gonna wait a couple more minutes. So it's been a good 25 minutes, and now it's kind of, the grout on the actual towels is a little bit crusty, and now I'm not getting anything but like a little bit of a powder on my finger. So at that point, we're ready to go. And like I said, I have 2 buckets of water, because once this gets too clouded with the grout, it's not gonna clean off very well. So my first step would be just to test an area, make sure that I'm not pulling the grout out of the joints. So just using circular motions is gonna be the best way to tool these joints. And then just make sure that you're not taking off any of the grout out of the joints. If you're seeing your grout being pulled out, then you're not ready. You got to wait a couple more minutes, let it set up a little bit more. But this is looking pretty good to me. And so you're just going to really pay attention to those joints and just kind of ever so lightly tool them with the grout, with the sponge. Now you're going to want a damp, just a damp sponge. You don't want to be having water coming off your sponge and running down the wall. It needs to be just kind of damp because the water will definitely run out your joints. Too much water is usually an enemy for most of these grouts because they just basically run out the joint, and you don't want, you'd have to fill that back in. And now you can fill some of this stuff in that if you miss something, you can always take a little bit of the grout and like if you have a pinhole or something like that, and just fill that in. And you don't want to go over too much, or you're going to end up having that water drip down the surface of the tile, which again will run out those joints. So try to go it over just a couple of times, but if you overdo it, then you're going to end up pulling too much grout out of it. One important thing about the grout is that you really kind of want to have it flush with the tile. You don't want it to be majorly recessed, or it'll end up kind of showing up as lippage in a way. You kind of end up seeing like the recess of that grout joint, and it kind of accents that tile. Even if it's nice and even with one another, it kind of looks like there's something off, and that's because the grout joint is recessed. So you want to really try to keep this flat, and that's why I like these sponges. They're really nice. They have the square edges, and they're, it's just a quality sponge. That's all I could say. It's like, it really makes a big difference than having any of those cheap, Home Depot sponges. And I don't really like the round edges either. I like the square edges because you can it makes sure that everything stays flat. But they are like, I don't know, $7 a sponge, so they're not cheap, but they work really well. So you should be able to be somewhat aggressive with this and not pull that grout off. All right. So my next big tip is to use a microfiber cloth after that, so just lightly go over it to wipe any of that excess water off, and that will prevent a lot of extra haze, unnecessary haze off of this, and make it a little bit easier to clean. So just take it ever so lightly. You're not really trying to tool the joint with this, you're just trying to wipe off some of that excess water. But I find this to be really great for all types of premixes and this, because that extra water that's kind of dripping off is really going to kind of, it's not going to be difficult to remove, but it's definitely going to be easier if you just wipe it down now and have the, a reduction of haze. Because this will haze over, it's going to kind of turn white, but it's, just another bit of water and a light scrubbing a couple hours later, you'll be good to go. But the microfiber cloth definitely will keep your work cleaner and a little bit easier to get ready. So, all right, so that was one bucket of water. This is looking pretty milky now at this point, so I'm going to switch over to my new bucket. This is why it doesn't really matter how much you really have on the tile, because you can see how easy that is to wipe off of there. So removing the grout off of the tile is like kind of secondary to making sure that those joints are filled. There's another pinhole. Sometimes you do get pinholes, so you got to fill those in, because otherwise you're gonna have to mix some more grout the next day, and that's not really fun. So this stuff is called bright white, and I'm not really sure exactly who comes up with that, because it's definitely somewhat of an off-white. It's not a white. So if you want really white grout, you're gonna have to get the stuff, it's called Arctic. in this brand. Seems like a lot of the bright whites are not exactly bright. They're kind of... All right, so another microfiber cloth. Lightly go over, just wipe off that excess water. Okay, takes care of that. Now, about an hour and a half, 2 hours later, there'll be probably a white film haze that will come over this. And then you're gonna have to wipe it down again with just some water and a sponge, scrub it, and you'll be able to remove that. Okay, so for the floor grout, we're going to use a high performance grout called PRISM. A couple tips on that. Number one, get yourself a really good grout float. This is made by Trox. Good grout float makes a world of difference. Get yourself a good sponge. So Ardex sponges are the best that I've found. They definitely remove the grout nicely. They have square edges, so they create a nice tool to be able to get those grout joints nicely. So with a high performance grout, high performance meaning that it's stain resistant, doesn't need sealed, and it's also a fine aggregate, so it can go down to 16th inch grout joints. So it's kind of like a, you know, a universal grout for everything. And one thing you want to do though is when you're mixing it, you want to be able to mix it by hand. That'll give you the better length of time on it. So make sure you measure your water. This is basically just 1 quart per bag. And this comes into 2 bag packages. So we'll mix their grout, but if you use a mixer, it will bring a lot of air into the mixture and just set a lot quicker. So you'll still be able to get the job done, but you're better off to take the 5 minutes and mix this by hand to get a good mixture. So I just have a little grout margin trowel, and we'll just go ahead and mix this up. Okay, so let that sit for about 5 minutes, and then we'll mix it up again before we go ahead and apply it. Okay, so after that slacks, just mix it up a little bit before you go and apply it. But what's nice about this is that it'll set up within about 20 minutes, and then you can clean things up and move on with your project. But I always recommend doing your floor last at the end of the day so that you can you know, make sure that everything stays nice and sound before you go finishing off the rest of the bathroom. Okay, so these mosaics definitely hog up a lot of grout, but you want to just take your damp sponge. You don't want to have too much water on it. That's one thing about floors. If you have any standing water in any of these seams, it's going to ruin the grout, cause pinhole leaks, or not pinhole leaks, but pinhole air bubbles, and you might have to go back later to address things. So try to make sure that all your thin set is out of your joints. I thought I had all of it. Okay, and then good grout float makes a world of difference. So you just want to pay attention, make sure you get all these joints filled. I wouldn't be too concerned about the leftover grout on the floor. It's more about making sure that everything's filled. Okay, so we'll let that set up. Probably a good solid 20 minutes before we can remove any of that. Okay, so about 20 minutes later, really 25 minutes later, you just want to see it feel kind of dry, and you want to try to eliminate pulling anything off of your finger. So test the joint. You want to be able to mold it, but you don't want to be pulling the grout out of the joints. I would always just test an area, do kind of some circular motions, see if you can just mold it without getting any of that grout out. So let's take a look here. And you really want to have the least amount of water on your sponge as possible. Water is just going to basically run out the joint. I would take some of the extra that you have left over, have that on hand to fill in some of the pinholes that you might have while you're removing this. So this mosaic floor turned out really tremendous. If you have a nice flat floor, really makes this easy to install. We obviously went with a white grout, which really gives a nice rich feel to this kind of modern retro bathroom. So hopefully some of the tips on how to install this tile will help you out. Just know this takes a little bit of patience and some time, and you'll be able to do this and make your bathroom look beautiful as well.